I should ask at the outset, how many members of the Maverick family are here? I know my wife is here. There's Barbara McGoy over there. This is something I have to be very careful of when I'm talking about the Maverick. So anyway, Barbara, just feel free, as any Maverick would, to stand up and tell me when I need to straighten things out. Okay. You have a picture on the screen above you of the founding Maverick in San Antonio, Samuel Augustus Maverick, who was the first Maverick in some ways and not so much in others. You can see in this picture he is looking very sober and serious, and you could think that this would be a talk that you could sort of start to nod off in, and nobody would care that much. You can see that this is another Maverick that doesn't look at all like Samuel Augustus. This is Henrietta Hen. Henrietta Hen is a Maverick, but she is not from Texas. She was made in New Jersey. And if you plug her in, she will poach 4 eggs or boil 6. And she is made by a company named Maverick in New Jersey, which is of no relation to the family. Next slide, which is another type of Maverick. This is not something you can tell very easily unless you're fluent in Chinese, but it's about Maverick wine that is made in Australia, and that is among the favorites, I think the top 200 favorite wines in China, which is what prompted this article. You have Maverick beer, which is brewed in California. Now looking at Maverick's Firewater Grill in Greencastle, Indiana, of all places, where you can probably have both the Maverick wine and the Maverick beer. Greencastle, Indiana is no more of a place that you would expect to see a grill. And we have the University of Nebraska Mavericks of Omaha, not the Dallas Mavericks, not the Mavericks of several other college and high school sports, but Maverick is also a favorite name for that. We have a number of hotels named Maverick, the Maverick Inn and Alpine. How many here have stayed in the Maverick Inn in Alpine? My wife has. It's right near the campus of Sulrosh University. How many have stayed in the Maverick Hostel in Irkutsk in Siberia? I've never found anyone who has stayed. It's only 2 hours from the Mongolian border. I don't understand why more people don't go there, but that's the last place you'd expect to see Maverick in Russia. But if that's a little too primitive for you, you can always go down to Budapest, metropolitan Budapest, where there is a Maverick hostel. If you want a resort, you can go to the Maverick Hotel on the Black Sea coast in Bulgaria. And then for a little bit of rustic nature, you can go to the Maverick Hostel in Fukushima, Japan. Or to get the bright lights of the city, just drop down to Bangkok and go to the Maverick Rachata Hotel in Bangkok. This is Cagliari, the capital of Sardinia, which has its Maverick Cafe. Maverick popcorn is sold in this shopping mall in Johannesburg, South Africa. And there are also a lot of Maverick events. This is the Maverick Folk Festival in Suffolk in England. And by this time, you can get the idea that maybe the word Maverick has just become so generic that it's lost all its meaning and doesn't really have any connection to the west, to San Antonio, to Texas, until you look at the logo of the Maverick Folk Festival in Suffolk, England, and there you have a Maverick on a bucking bronco. The Maverick name does still mean something about untamed or Maverick Western. We were in the mid-'80s, we were with our family in Dover in England, going down to the White Cliffs, and there on the street was the Maverick restaurant. We took our then 10-year-old son and stood him, who's named Maverick, and stood him in front of that. But there you see a connection with the with the cattle. And I could mention at this point that the name Maverick as a given name is also becoming more and more popular. It's something like the 200th most used boys' names for babies, according to the Johnson & Johnson Baby Center. And also, as a girl's name, it's becoming more and more popular. I think it's something like 1100th in popularity, something like that. So Maverick and I, or Mary and I are driving through the rainforest in Costa Rica, and look at the sign we see there. But it all does come back to the Texas Longhorns, to cattle, to the wide open range, and to Samuel Maverick, who had come from South Carolina to Texas, and before that the family had come from Boston. This is Maverick Station on the Underground in Boston. This is one stop toward the city from Logan Airport, and it's located on what was once an island in the bay called Noddle's Island. And this is about a block from the home of the first Maverick in America, Samuel Maverick, who came in 1624. But he was sort of a maverick in that he came to a Puritan colony, but he was an Anglican. And he could not hold public office. His children could not be baptized in the church. And although he was a respected citizen, he wasn't given the accord that he felt a decent member of the empire should be given. So he did what a lot of mavericks will do. He went to the top and complained. He took a ship over to Boston to Charles II. Charles II never did like Puritans very much, and he thought that Samuel Maverick would make a fine royal commissioner. So Samuel Maverick took the boat back to Massachusetts as a commissioner and proceeded to stick it to some of his one-time adversaries. 100 years later, there was a Samuel Maverick in the Boston Massacre. This is a print made by Paul Revere, and if you look very closely at the names of the victims that show at the bottom, in the very bottom there's a list, there's a mention of Samuel Maverick, who was a young man who had fallen into bad company with colonial sympathizers, and one night found himself, unfortunately, in front of the State House in Boston, and was among those killed, and you can see his grave today in the old granary burying ground in Boston. Jump another 100 years ahead, and the Mavericks have turned up in South Carolina. This is Samuel Maverick, who was the father of our Samuel Maverick, who was a planter in northwestern South Carolina, and also a businessman in Charleston. On the plantation, the Mavericks were neighbors of John C. Calhoun. And yet the Mavericks did not think that states' rights was necessarily a very good idea. And so they actually opposed Calhoun on states' rights. And Samuel Maverick's son, Samuel, who was our Samuel, who came to Texas, went to Yale, studied law, came back to practice law in South Carolina. But he was surprised to find out he wasn't getting too much business because he didn't like states' rights. So his father sent him off to run a plantation in Alabama. He was in business doing some business in New Orleans, heard about the Texas Revolution, and he just literally bolted for Texas and found himself at the Alamo. But as a lawyer, he and James Bonham, who had also been a lawyer in Pendleton, were elected by the Alamo delegation to represent them at the Texas Constitutional Convention and to sign the Declaration of Independence. James Bonham thought of himself more as a man of action, so he stayed, and they elected a replacement, and to Bonham's later regret. And Samuel Maverick got out just in time to sign the Texas Declaration. He ended up coming back to San Antonio, not a safe time with his family, young family. The Mexican, independence from Mexico had been gained. Mexico didn't believe it. They kept coming up, sending armies up to San Antonio. So he took his family to the most remote place he could think of, which was Matagorda Peninsula down on the Texas coast. And there he signed this document. Among his other enterprises, he was half owner in a steamboat company. He was a developer He did land speculation, but he also got into cattle. He bought a farm on Matagorda Peninsula in this agreement from a guy whose name was Charles Tilton, down at the lower left. If you wonder about who your neighbors were in those days of early Texas, Charles Tilton had grown up in New Hampshire as he was one of 13 kids. He decided to go to sea, and he ended up as a bosun's mate with Jean Lafitte, the pirate who was based on Galveston Island. Tilton went straight and got into farming and cattle raising, but he eventually sold to Samuel Maverick, and this is the bill of sale for the cattle, which became the first Maverick cattle. This is the Maverick brand, SAM for Samuel Augustus Maverick. It's not a brand that you would be very familiar with because, as far as we can tell, it was never used. He left his, he came back to San Antonio, left his cattle in charge of some slaves. This is the mother of Jack, who was, this was Samuel Maverick's, one of his nurses when he was growing up in South Carolina, came with the family to Texas and stayed on Matagorda Island to run things with her son Jack, who was 19 and who really should not have been expected to brand cattle. It was more than a 19-year-old could handle. Samuel Maverick had about 400 head, and the calves began wandering off the unbranded, off the peninsula onto the Texas mainland, where they became known as, of course, Maverick's cattle, because everybody else kept their cattle pretty well branded. Finally, Samuel Maverick decided to move his cattle. There are some who would say that Maverick didn't really care about the cattle. He just took them in payment for a debt, and there are other various stories like that which don't really bear out the facts. Samuel Maverick actually moved his cattle. He came down and was essentially a trail driver in the 1850s and helped with two of his sons and with some vaqueros, took his cattle from Matagorda Peninsula there at the lower, at the right center, and over a period of several weeks they moved the cattle across South Texas to Goliad and then up along the San Antonio River to Conquista Ranch, which was a 10,000-acre ranch that that Sam Maverick apparently thought the cattle was too big for the cattle to stray far from, because he put the cattle back in charge of Jack. Jack didn't brand the cattle. The cattle started wandering even farther afield. And so in 1856, Sam Maverick got the idea he should sell the herd, and he sold them to a neighboring rancher named Augustine Toutant Beauregard. This is the younger brother of the Confederate General Pierre Toutant Beauregard, who fired the first shots on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. But this was 1856, and Augustine bought the cattle as well as the ones that were unbranded. But since the unbranded cattle had to be rounded up, he sent his crews across South Texas looking for unbranded cattle. They went across 10 counties in South Texas. Obviously, if a cow was unbranded, it belonged to Sam Maverick. So he ended up with a very substantial herd. And that was a good thing, because after the Civil War, the railroad was coming west, and it came into Kansas, got to Abilene, Kansas, and the Texas cowboys found they could drive a herd of as many as 10,000 cattle up the trails to Kansas and put them on the trains to be shipped east. And as the Texas cowboys came up the trail, they brought with them the term Maverick as an unbranded cow. So sure enough, the word Maverick began slipping into the English language. Within just a few years, it had spread throughout the entire West. This is a postcard from about 1910 that is titled "Branding a Maverick on an Oregon Range." The name Maverick was pretty popular in the Northeast, where cowboys and Buffalo Bill and the Wild West were really highly thought of. This is a tobacco trading card from New York City, showing a young man being bucked off a steer named Maverick. Boys magazines, the pulp fiction of the day, love to use the word Maverick. This is from a magazine with one story in it. It came out one week in a publication called Brave and Bold. And the title of this story was Young Maverick, the boy from nowhere, who became the young oil king of Texas. And if you can read this dramatic, the caption under this dramatic picture, it says, "Up into the air went young Maverick, and down into the I can't read it too well, but anyway, they plunged down the river with a tremendous splash." The word Maverick was really becoming very tied with adventure. The Maverick word also got into politics. Theodore Roosevelt had been a rancher. He owned 3 or 4 ranches out in North Dakota. And when he was running for president in 1904, he wanted the Western vote. So he used the word Maverick in a kind of a negative sense. One of his campaign buttons was a steer with bearing the brands of the 3 brands that Theodore Roosevelt had used as a Maverick. And the idea was, brand yourself with the Roosevelt brand and don't be a maverick and run away from the herd. And of course, Roosevelt won the Western vote and won the election. But while the use of the word had spread up through the cattle trails and into the American language, there was some question as to how it actually had occurred. People had forgotten that it had come from Texas. They finally figured out there was a guy named Sam Maverick in Texas. This is a picture of John McCoy, who was a cattleman, a big broker up in Abilene, Kansas. He received many of the cattle that came up the trail from Texas and promoted. He was kind of a self-promoter, and he called himself the real McCoy. So the gentleman you're looking up here is officially the real McCoy. Joseph McCoy also wrote the first history of the American range in 1874, a very thick book that talked about cowboys and cattle and all things Western. And Sam Maverick gets a mention in that for his having branded or not branded the cattle. But the spelling of the name was not consistent. And McCoy understood that that the word was spelled M-A-U-V-R-I-C-K, Maverick, which sounded French enough in Abilene, Kansas, for him to call Sam Maverick a certain old Frenchman. Maverick was also called in a San Antonio paper, a correspondent from New York called Sam Maverick an old German. And he's been called just about everything. People have said that he branded every cattle he could find, and that's why they were called Mavericks. Others said that he never branded any cattle, but that he was the largest cattle owner in the American West. Not true. He never owned more than 400 where he sold them. But in any event, even William Safire, who was one of the speechwriters for the White House when Nixon was president, he's the guy who invented remember the term for the press, nattering nabobs of negativism. That's our friend William Safire here, who also wrote a political dictionary of the American language. And in this, he termed Samuel Maverick a cattleman who did not brand his cattle because he believed it was cruelty to animals. Figure that one out. There's also this character named John Gould, who was up in the state of Maine. He, for 40 years, wrote a column for the Christian Science Monitor. And in one of those, he got into the origin of the term Maverick, and he said that Sam Maverick was never in Texas in his life. He was a Puritan in New England. I always thought a lot of New Englanders were pretty confused, but this kind of takes the cake. The The man who probably personified the term maverick most in the 20th century was our very own Maury Maverick, who was elected. He was a grandson of Samuel Maverick, the cattleman, the non-branding cattleman. He was elected mayor of San Antonio, and he was also elected to the Congress of the United States. And if anyone doubted that Maury was a true maverick, this photo is of him in Detroit, Michigan, speaking in behalf of the United Auto Workers Union, something that very few Democrats were doing in the 1930s, and certainly none from the South or from Texas. So he had a short career both as congressman and as mayor. He also had the quaint idea that people had a right to free speech in America. So when the local Communist Party applied for a permit to use the municipal auditorium for a rally, Maury Maverick said free speech, stamped it, and the rally was broken up in a riot, and the Ku Klux Klan went looking for Maury. They did not find him, fortunately, because during World War II, he was in Washington as the head of the Small War Production Board. Well, he started looking at some of this governmentese that was used in reports, and he said it reminded him of a gobbling turkey in Texas, and so he coined the word gobbledygook. There is no doubt as to the origin of this word, because about 3 months after he did a memo forbidding his staff from using gobbledygook in any of their reports, the New York Times asked him to do a magazine article on the origin of the word gobbledygook, and this was the illustration for that article in the New York Times in 1944. After that, the word maverick has really permeated itself into American culture. There was a company in California called the Maverick Motor Company, which was truly a Maverick auto company. They started to manufacture sports cars using fiberglass shells, and they took pieces. They'd take fenders from Studebakers and bumpers from Chevrolets and put it together. And they made about 7 custom Maverick sports cars. Others were sold in kits, so there were a number of them out there. And the car has actually become a real classic in sports car meets, and has a very distinguished sort of I guess an Art Deco logo or something. But the Maverick car that most of us remember, it was the Ford Maverick, which was a compact that Ford came out with in 1959. It was one of their best-selling cars right from the start. But they also, as you can tell, were very careful to keep their roots in with Texas and with the Maverick family. In fact, they even gave a car as a promotion to Jim Maverick, who lived here in San Antonio. Sam Maverick's only surviving grandson in San Antonio. But there it is on the Texas range with a brand at the lower right. These cars were branded Mavericks, unlike some of the cattle. Nice Texas Longhorn wedged in the V. About this time, you also had James Garner coming on TV as Maverick. There was Barbarita's and Mary's uncle was a teacher at professor at the University of Virginia, lived in Charlottesville on a hilltop, and down at the side of the road he had a mailbox. It said Maverick on the mailbox. And sure enough, some of the local cowboys went up and they kept shooting up his mailbox, and he had to move his mailbox off the road. But it was a very popular TV. In fact, each of the networks had their own type of, I almost said, own brand of Maverick show through the years. James Garner came to San Antonio to play a game of cards with Maury Maverick Jr. to promote the show, and you can get an idea from the facial expressions that Maury Jr. does not think he's going to win this game. The Maverick movie, James Garner is an older person in this movie. He does not play the star, but Mel Gibson does. And there are a number of Maverick movies, The Maverick Queen, and a few others that were coming out in the 50s and the 60s. One of the great events in California is what is it called? The Titans of Maverick. The Titans of Maverick is the name of a surfing contest that occurs only when the waves out on off the Pacific coast get to a certain height. And then the word goes out, and surfers have about 2 days to get there and compete in the Titans of Maverick, which has its own particular name origin. In the early 1960s, before surfing was that much of a big thing, there were some friends who were walking down the coast one day, and they, with their dog, which had been named Maverick from the Maverick TV show, and they looked out and they saw these enormous waves that none of them had ever seen before off the Texas coast, off the California coast, about an hour south of San Francisco. And so they decided the waves were a little bit too rough for their dog Maverick to risk taking their dog Maverick out into the waves. And so they tied him to a stake while they went out and tried surfing the waves. And when they came back, they felt so guilty about having deprived their dog of this experience that they named the place Maverick's Point. So when the word got out about these waves, the waves were called Mavericks. So when Apple Computer comes out with its new series of operating systems and wants to name them after important landmarks in California, the first operating system was named OS X Mavericks after the waves. So if you take this back a little ways, the Mavericks are the descendant of a dog named Maverick, which was named for a TV show named Maverick, which was actually named for San Antonio's Samuel Maverick. So the Apple Mavericks operating system is a great grandson or great grandchild of our own Samuel Maverick. Mavericks in the military, this is the 175th Aviation Company in the Vietnam War. Kind of an unintentional Maverick implication here, I'm sure. There you have a bull snorting, or a steer, snorting green olive branches of peace, while the words at the bottom, Sat Cong, means kill the Viet Cong. So you've got some more conundrums here regarding Mavericks. The Maverick missile came out during the Gulf War. It is credited, there was something like 7,000 of them fired during the Gulf War, and it's credited with a major factor in the Allied victory in the Gulf War, and is now in the arsenals of about 40 militaries worldwide. Even though if you've got a weapon, you don't want it to be a Maverick, you want it to go where you're aiming it at. I guess the idea is to confuse the enemy. Maverick continues to be a big name in politics. The idea that the original Mavericks, as this campaign button indicates, were John McCain and Sarah Palin, was a major issue during the election of what was it, 2006, 2008. Whatever it was, so many people debated what the term Maverick really meant that Merriam-Webster counted Maverick as its 8th most frequently used word during the year of 2008. I'm not sure that anybody really decided what it meant, but in any event, it got everybody talking about Mavericks and wondering just what Mavericks were. This is a poster that was put out by Ford when they came out with their Maverick car in the center, which is one of the world's great Mavericks. You see some of the others are Sigmund Freud and the Red Baron and Lady Godiva. And the message here however, is fairly clear. You don't have to be a member of the Maverick family to be a Maverick. All you have to be is you have to be independent. You have to go against the grain and do things that you think are important. And that way, all of us in the room can also be Mavericks. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'd be glad to. Question over here, yes.
What about Maverick County? How did that go?
Sam Maverick, of course. Maverick County and Eagle Pass is the county seat. That was named in 1854 for Samuel Maverick, who was still alive, and apparently they. No, I think he owned some land there. He owned land most everywhere in South Texas. He was not the largest landowner in Texas. He was something like the, 10th largest. He would buy land all over the state in small pieces. Unlike Richard King, who bought all this land together, Maverick bought land all over the state. He especially liked to buy springs or headwaters. When the U.S. Army was looking for a place to put in a fort, he would sell them the property at a great price. Fort Clark was built on the springs that Sam Maverick owned, but he did own some land in Eagle Pass or in Maverick County. But I think they were mainly looking for names to put on all the new counties that were being organized of that type, and it was an Austin thing. We all know what decisions people make in Austin. So anyway, other questions from Mavericks? Yes.
I wondered how he was able to purchase the properties. Was he reinvesting what he earned from his cattle? What was his?
How did he? The question was, where did Samuel Maverick get all his money to invest, and did it come from selling the cattle? No, he may have broken even on the cattle. I'm not sure. He lost some. He bought some, and it was not a very profitable deal. But his family, he came from a wealthy family, and his father, Samuel Maverick, whose portrait we saw up here, was a planter and a wealthy, owned a number of plantations himself throughout the South. He would send Sam Maverick money to help buy the land. And in fact, the Conquista Ranch, where the land where the cattle were taken, was purchased in part with money from South Carolina. And one reason he sold his cattle is because his father had died, and they were distributing the land among the descendants, and so the cattle had to go somewhere.
So was that like cotton that was big money maker?
Land was pretty much, this was even before cotton, but it was once the oil, unfortunately, when Sam Maverick sold his land, the family didn't keep the mineral rights. That's been sort of a sore point, I know, with my wife and a few others. Anyway, but no, land was a big thing, and he could buy so much for so little and sell it for so much that you can make profits, and then it sort of built on itself. When he was here a week before the Alamo fell, he was buying land in San Antonio. He came to San Antonio because this was the courthouse. Bexar County covered a wide area of Texas at the time, and so since you wanted to be close to where the deeds were written, San Antonio was the place to be. Yes?
You know where his original house was?
Samuel Maverick had several houses. In fact, somebody did a story for the Southwestern Historical Quarterly on the homes of Samuel Maverick, but he lived for a while they had a home on Main Plaza, the northeast corner of Main Plaza at the river. But the place where the main house associated with him stood within the grounds of the Alamo, where the Gibbs building is now. There is a historical marker for Samuel Maverick on the Gibbs building, and that's because his house was there. The house.
I have a question. I'm over here.
Question, yes.
I read an article in Texas Monthly Magazine about 2 months ago that was a story of Sam Maverick. And I was wondering, did they consult you at all about that? Because it was very much a condensed version of what your book was.
I think it probably Texas Highways magazine. Yes, they did. They did. They talked to me a lot, and I was impressed with the author's effort to get to what the facts really were. Because one thing that I've kind of touched on, which the book touches on a lot too, is how scattered the stories become and how people almost pull things out of just out of plain air to come up with the stories. But that writer really stuck to the truth. Yes. Connection between the McNeil family and the Mavericks. Well, as I was talking with somebody on the way in, there's some McNeils who are Mavericks and some who are not. One of the McNeils married a Maverick, and Barbara, that would have been one of it was a son of Albert Maverick Jr., daughter of Albert Maverick Sr., married a McNeil who had been a Texas Ranger. I think he was a fairly prominent McNeil. And so there are lots of people by the name of McNeil. But the Texas Ranger McNeil had some siblings who did not have the good fortune to marry Mavericks. And so...
What about the Maverick building? What street is that on?
The Maverick building on Houston Street is on the site of the Maverick Hotel. They cut North Presa Street right through the middle of the hotel and took it out, but that was built by George Maverick. Samuel Mavericks had several sons who were very active in land development in San Antonio, and Houston Street was a big area. They had there's an Albert Maverick Jr., or an Albert Maverick building on Houston Street near the Gibbs Building, the Valencia Hotel, St. Mary's and Houston Street. There is a building there that is known as the George Maverick Building because he built that, and George Maverick also, this is the son of Samuel, also built the Maverick Building on Houston Street. They got up to, it was supposed to be 22 stories, they got up to 10. There was some kind of a financial crunch, and so it stopped there, and that's why it doesn't have any decoration on the top. Yeah, the three that I mentioned still are, yes. Well, actually, the Maverick Building is apartments. It's middle-income apartment housing and is pretty successful. The other one was saved by the Valencia Hotel. It was a drugstore or something right at the basic four corners of San Antonio, and that's, I don't know, gift shop. I don't know what it is for the hotel. Yes?
Yes. Does a Maverick family ever have reunions? And if so, how many come?
Oh, goodness. The Maverick family had a reunion about 3 months ago at the Whitty Museum, and there were 400 people there. They came from all over. One of the curious things about, I guess, a family like the Mavericks is there is such a sense of identity because of Samuel Maverick and the word, the name, and the popularity of the word. I think it's created a bond among the third, fourth, fifth cousins. It's unusual, and the reason would be simply just the identity that the family has maintained and how it keeps coming up. And like every time somebody runs for president, the Wall Street Journal and New York Times go off looking for real Mavericks, and so they write them up, and so that helps. Although I could say that at the 400 people at the reunion, of course, half of them maybe roughly were spouses, but a very small percentage were named Maverick because so many others have married into McNeils and things that they have other names. So that's why I asked at the beginning what other Mavericks are out there, because they won't be named Maverick, and it's very, very risky. Oh, my wife is pointing out that I do have a few copies of the books which I can sign if anybody would like some here at the back table.